Shocking true crime. Wife discovers husband's dark double life at retirement seminar. Hook. What if everything you knew about your life was a lie? What if your own husband was hiding a dark, dangerous secret? Stick around, because the shocking truth behind this twisted double life will leave you speechless. You won't believe what happens next. Lena had always trusted Thomas. They'd built a life together, brick by brick. The house, the kids, the quiet evenings. But something changed when Thomas retired. He was different, distant. It started with his late nights in the office. Then, the strange calls. He never let her hear the other end. She tried to brush it off. Retirement wasn't easy for anyone. But then she found it. An old notebook, hidden behind a stack of papers in his study. The leather cover was worn, faded. She flipped it open, trembling. The pages were filled with names, dates, cryptic notes. Her stomach sank. One name stood out. Maya. She'd never heard of Maya before. Lena felt a chill. She skimmed more pages. Meetings, plans, a different side of Thomas. A side she didn't know. The notes became darker. Lena's heart pounded. Her fingers shook as she turned the pages. Her mind raced with questions. Why hadn't he told her? What was he hiding? The last entry sent a jolt of terror through her. Tomorrow. Midnight. No turning back. Lena dropped the notebook. It fell open on the floor, the last words staring back at her. The air in the room grew thick. The silence was suffocating. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. What was he involved in? Why hadn't he mentioned it? The more she thought, the more unsettled she became. Her mind spun. She needed answers. Lena decided to confront him. She waited until he came home. His footsteps echoed down the hall. He stepped through the door. His face was unreadable. "Lena," he said, his voice low. She stood. Her breath caught in her throat. "I found something." His eyes flickered. Just for a moment. He tried to mask it, but she saw it. Fear. And then it was gone. He was calm again. Too calm. Lena didn't back down. "Who's Maya?" she asked. The room went still. Thomas froze. His jaw clenched. For a moment, the air was thick with tension. Lena took a step forward. He finally spoke. "That's none of your concern." Lena's eyes narrowed. She didn't buy it. "I want the truth," she demanded. Thomas's face darkened. His voice was sharp. "You don't understand." Lena's heart raced. She could feel the weight of his words. The tension was unbearable. She had to know. Lena wasn't going to let this go. Not anymore. "You've been lying to me," she said quietly. He didn't reply. He turned and walked toward the door. Lena watched him. Her mind screamed at her to stop him. But she didn't. She followed. Every step felt like a lifetime. And then, the door slammed. Leaving Lena standing in the dark, Lena stood there, the cold air seeping into her skin. The door had slammed so hard it echoed through the house. Her thoughts raced. She was alone now, but she knew something wasn't right. Her heart pounded as she stared at the door. Was he hiding something, or was he guilty? The silence in the house was deafening. Lena's mind was a whirlwind of questions. She couldn't just let this go. She grabbed her coat and headed for the door. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with the keys. She wasn't sure what she was going to find, but she had to know. She drove through the empty streets, her headlights cutting through the fog. The streets felt abandoned, ghostly. Where was he? Where was Thomas? She followed the directions written in the notebook. They led her to a dark alley, where a dim light flickered at the end. Lena's breath quickened. She parked the car and stepped out. The gravel crunched beneath her feet. She swallowed hard. There was a strange, eerie calm about the place. The air smelled of dampness and decay. A sense of dread crawled up her spine. Lena reached the door at the end of the alley. Her hand hovered over the handle. It was old, rusted, but she had to open it. She had to find out what Thomas had been hiding. With a quick breath, she pushed the door open. The creak of the hinges sounded like a warning. Inside, the room was dark, save for the weak light coming from the far corner. She took a step inside. The floorboard creaked under her weight. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light. The room was sparse, except for a table in the middle. On the table were photos, old, yellowing photographs. Some of them were of Thomas, others not so much. Lena's eyes scanned the room. There, in the corner, a figure stood. A woman. She was watching Lena with cold, calculating eyes. It was Maya. Lena's breath caught in her throat. Maya smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was chilling. Lena took a step back. "What is this?" she whispered. Maya's voice was low, almost hypnotic. "You've finally figured it out." Lena froze. What did she mean? How did she know? Maya stepped closer, her eyes never leaving Lena. "I've been waiting for you," she said softly. The words hung in the air like smoke. Lena's mind spun. Had Thomas been involved in something terrible? Was he a part of something bigger? Maya reached for a photo on the table and slid it toward Lena. It was a picture of a man. Lena stared at it. She recognized him. It was someone from the past, someone Thomas had once known. Maya's voice broke through her thoughts. "He's not who you think he is." Lena felt the blood drain from her face. What had Thomas really been hiding? What was he involved in? She wasn't sure if she was ready to find out that Maya's gaze was piercing, like she could see straight through Lena. The photo lay heavy in Lena's hands, a sinking weight in her chest. She couldn't tear her eyes away. That man, the one in the photo. Lena had seen him before, years ago, at a dinner party. He'd smiled at her from across the room, but Thomas had never mentioned him. Lena's mind raced. Why was he in this? What was Thomas involved in? Maya stepped closer, her voice a whisper. Thomas didn't just retire. Lena looked up sharply. Her heart hammered in her chest. "What do you mean?" Maya smirked. "He's part of something much darker." Lena shook her head. "No, he wouldn't." But Maya interrupted. "Oh, he would. You just never saw it." Lena's thoughts swirled. Had she really been so blind? All those years, the quiet moments, the late nights? Maya leaned in closer. "Do you know what he's been doing? While you were asleep." Lena swallowed hard. Her mouth went dry. The room felt smaller, suffocating. The walls seemed to close in. Maya's voice was soft, almost soothing. "He's been running things, organizing the deals, the jobs." Lena took a step back, the photo still clutched in her hands. The words hit her like a blow to the stomach. What did Maya mean by running things? Lena couldn't breathe. Her legs felt weak. Maya continued. "He's been working for them. The ones you've heard whispers about. The ones who dealt in shadows." Lena felt her pulse in her throat. Thomas wasn't just her husband. He was something else. Something dangerous. Maya's smile grew. "You've been living a lie, Lena." Lena's world tilted. Her thoughts scattered like leaves in a storm. She tried to steady herself, but nothing felt real anymore. "Who are you?" Lena whispered. Maya laughed softly, a sound that sent shivers down Lena's spine. "You've never asked that before, have you?" Maya's eyes gleamed. "I'm the one who's been cleaning up the mess." Lena recoiled. "Cleaning up? What mess?" But before she could process the words, a loud bang echoed from the doorway. A figure stepped into the room. Thomas. His face was grim. His eyes locked on Maya, and then to Lena. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Lena's breath caught. Thomas's voice was barely a whisper. "Lena, you shouldn't have come." Lena's heart dropped to her stomach. Thomas stood there, his presence so cold it felt like the room had frozen. Maya stepped back, a flicker of something dark in her eyes. Thomas didn't take his eyes off Lena. His jaw tightened. The weight of his gaze felt like 1,000 pounds pressing on her chest. I didn't want this," he muttered almost to himself. Lena opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. Her mind raced, trying to piece everything together. Her husband, the man she thought she knew, was tied to this world. A world she'd never even imagined. Lena wanted to scream, but her throat was dry, raw. Thomas stepped closer, his every move deliberate. "You don't understand," he said, his voice strained. Maya was silent now, watching, waiting. Lena's hands clenched around the photo. "Understand what?" she managed to say, her voice shaking. "Everything," Thomas replied, his eyes flickering with something, regret, guilt. Lena could barely breathe. She needed answers. "Why didn't you tell me?" she demanded, stepping forward. Thomas's face twisted in a painful way, as if he was battling something inside. He exhaled, long and slow. "There's no easy way to say it, Lena. I didn't want you to be involved. I never wanted you to know." Lena's breath caught. "Know what? That you've been living a lie? That the man I've loved all these years is this?" Her voice cracked, the hurt so deep it almost swallowed her whole. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, as if bracing himself. "I've done things," he said quietly. "Things I can't take back." Lena's chest ached. The truth hung in the air like a thick fog. Maya's lips curled into a knowing smile. "She's right, you know," she said softly. "You've been hiding for years, Thomas. But now, there's no escaping." Lena's gaze flickered from Maya to Thomas, confusion and betrayal warring inside her. "What do you mean?" she whispered. Maya stepped forward, her voice cold. "He's not just a retired man. He's part of something much bigger, Lena. Something you'll never be able to outrun." Lena's eyes widened, her pulse quickening. Thomas stepped between them, his body tense. "Enough, Maya," he growled, his voice rising. But Maya only smirked, stepping back into the shadows. Lena's mind spun, a storm of terror and disbelief. Thomas was caught in this web, this life he had never shared with her. How deep did it go? What had she been living with all these years? And then, in the silence, the truth broke through, shattering everything she thought she knew. "I didn't just retire, Lena. I was forced out." Lena froze. Asterisk forced out. Asterisk. Her voice barely made it out. Thomas's eyes softened. "You don't understand how dangerous it is. What I've been mixed up in." Maya's right. "It's too late now." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Lena's head swam with shock, with questions that she didn't even know how to ask. And then the room went silent, except for the faint sound of a distant car engine starting. Lena didn't even realize she was holding her breath until she let it go. Thomas's eyes darted toward the door. It was timed that Thomas's eyes were wild now, darting between Lena and the door. His fingers twitched at his sides. Maya stood perfectly still, her expression unreadable. Lena's chest tightened, but she refused to look away from him. "Who is it?" she demanded. Thomas shook his head, his voice low. "You need to leave. Right now." But Lena couldn't move. Her legs felt like they were made of stone. She stared at Thomas, searching his face for any hint of the man she thought she knew. He was someone else, someone she no longer recognized. "What's happening, Thomas?" Lena whispered. His eyes flickered to Maya, then back to her. "It's over," he said, his voice breaking. "I was trying to protect you from all of it." Lena's heart slammed against her ribs. Protect her? From what? She finally found her voice again, but it trembled. You think you're protecting me by lying? By hiding everything? Thomas didn't answer. The silence stretched between them, thick with tension. And then, the sound of tires screeching outside broke the stillness. Lena's breath hitched. It was too late. The door slammed open, and two men stormed in, their faces masked, their movements swift and controlled. Lena's heart froze in her chest. The room shifted in an instant, the air heavy with danger. Thomas moved in front of her, a shield. He wasn't just hiding anymore. He was protecting her. Or was he? The men stood in the doorway, watching them, their eyes cold and calculating. One of them stepped forward, his voice rough. "You're coming with us." Lena's blood ran cold. Thomas tensed, his hand twitching at his side. "No," he said firmly, his voice like steel. "This is between me and them." The man sneered, glancing at Maya. "You've got no choice, Thomas. You've made your bed. Now lie in it." Lena's pulse quickened. The fear that had been creeping in her chest for so long was now a full, suffocating presence. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. She had to get out. But before she could move, Thomas stepped back toward her, his hand reaching for her. "I'm sorry, Lena," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The men's eyes flickered to each other. Lena barely had time to react before one of them lunged forward. Her vision blurred with panic as Thomas tried to push her out of harm's way. But it wasn't fast enough. She felt a hand grab her wrist, pulling her back. "No," she screamed, struggling against the grip. But the man held her tightly, dragging her away. Thomas shouted her name, but it was too late. Lena was pulled toward the door, her feet stumbling over the floor. The last thing she saw before the door slammed shut behind her was Thomas, his face a mask of pain and helplessness. And then, darkness, the cold night air hit Lena like a slap in the face as she was shoved out the door. Her mind raced, her body fighting to break free of the iron grip on her wrist. But the man was strong, relentless. Lena's heart thundered in her chest as she tried to twist away. She could barely catch her breath, her thoughts spiraling out of control. What was happening? Where were they taking her? She fought harder, but the grip didn't loosen. The car sat there, engine running, its headlights glaring like a predator's eyes. The man pushed her toward it. She tried to scream, but his hand covered her mouth. His fingers were cold, rough, as he yanked her into the back seat. The door slammed shut, and the world outside seemed to vanish. She was enclosed now, in the suffocating space of the car, with nothing but the sound of her own breathing. The man sitting across from her said nothing. He just stared at her with those emotionless eyes, like she was nothing more than a problem to be dealt with. Lena's pulse raced as she tried to make sense of everything. Where was Thomas? Why had they taken her? What did they want with her? Her hands were still trembling. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts. And then, just as the panic began to settle, the man finally spoke. "Thomas made a mistake," he said quietly, his voice low, almost too calm. Lena froze, her eyes locked onto his. What do you mean?" she stammered. The man's lips curled into a thin, almost amused smile. "You've been living in a dream, lady. Thomas didn't just retire. He crossed a line. And now, there's no going back." Lena's stomach twisted. Crossed a line? What had he done? Her mind was spinning, and she could barely keep up. The car sped through the streets, turning corners sharply, as if they were being chased. Or maybe they were the ones chasing. Lena's breath quickened as the landscape outside blurred, her thoughts a tangled mess. She had to get out of here. She had to find out what was going on. And then, in the distance, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A building looming in the darkness. It looked abandoned, but there was something about it that felt wrong. "Where are we?" Lena whispered, her voice trembling. The man beside her didn't respond. Instead, the car pulled into the driveway of the dark building. The headlights illuminated the crumbling walls. Lena's eyes widened in fear. This wasn't just any building. This was the place from the photographs, the place she had been warned about. Her hands clenched into fists as the car came to a stop. The door opened, and the man grabbed her arm again, pulling her roughly out of the car. Lena stumbled, her legs unsteady beneath her. "Get inside," he growled, pushing her toward the entrance. Her mind screamed for her to run, but she didn't have the strength. Her body moved against her will, dragging her toward the building, the door swinging open with a groan of rusted metal. And then the world around her shifted. The door closed behind her with a final, ominous thud. Lena was inside the air inside. The building was thick, damp, and smelled of decay. Every step Lena took echoed through the empty space, the sound hollow and distant. The man kept his grip firm on her arm, guiding her deeper into the darkness. The only light came from a flickering bulb overhead, casting long, distorted shadows on the cracked walls. Lena's heart hammered in her chest, the sound drowning out everything else. Where was she? Why had they brought her here? Her mind raced, but fear paralyzed her thoughts. The man stopped at a door, his hand tightening on her arm as he opened it. Lena's breath caught in her throat when she saw what was inside. A small, dimly lit room, a table in the center, and sitting at the table, Thomas. He was hunched over, his face in his hands. Lena's stomach dropped. He looked nothing like the man she'd known. His clothes were disheveled, his eyes hollow, like he hadn't slept in days. Thomas didn't move when the door opened. Lena's legs trembled beneath her as she stepped forward. "Thomas," she whispered, barely able to form the word. He didn't look up. The man beside her pushed her forward, making her stumble toward him. "You're here now," he said, his voice sharp. Lena's eyes locked onto Thomas, but he still didn't respond. She reached out to touch his shoulder. "Thomas, what's going on?" "Please, talk to me," she begged, her voice trembling. He finally lifted his head, his eyes vacant and distant. But there was something else in them, something dark. "I'm sorry, Lena," he whispered. The words cut through her like a blade. "I didn't want you to get involved. I never wanted you to see this side of me." Lena's voice cracked. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you trust me?" Thomas looked away, as if the weight of his actions was too much to bear. "I thought I was protecting you," he said, his voice breaking. "Protecting me from what?" The man beside her stepped forward. "You don't get it, do you?" he said coldly. Thomas wasn't just a victim in all of this. He was a part of it. The very thing Lena had been trying to make sense of, the dark life Thomas had been leading, was bigger than anything she had ever imagined. The man's eyes flicked to the door, then back to her. "You should have never followed him. You should have stayed away," he spat. Lena's mind was reeling. What did he mean? Why did he speak like that? What had Thomas done? Suddenly, the truth felt like it was slipping out of her grasp, unraveling like a thread she couldn't hold onto. Thomas was involved in something far more dangerous than she had ever realized. Her thoughts were interrupted by a voice from the shadows, a cold, deep voice. "You've been a problem for too long, Thomas." Lena's eyes snapped to the figure that had appeared in the doorway. It was a man she didn't recognize, tall, imposing, his face hidden in the dark. Thomas tensed, his body going rigid at the sound of the voice. "Who are you?" Lena demanded, her voice shaky. The man stepped into the light. His smile was chilling, almost predatory. "I'm the one who gets things done," he said with a slow, deliberate smile. Lena's pulse quickened, and then she saw it. The cold, calculating glint in his eyes. The danger that radiated from him. Lena was trapped. The man's eyes never left Lena as he stepped fully into the room, his presence like a shadow that consumed everything around him. Lena's breath hitched, the air in the room growing thicker with each passing second. Her legs felt like lead, but she refused to look away. Thomas, still silent and broken, didn't seem to notice the man's arrival. He was lost in his own mind, too far gone to even recognize the danger they were in. Lena's pulse raced in her ears, a dull thrum that drowned out the rest of the room. The man's voice cut through the silence, low and smooth. "You've made quite the mess, Thomas, and now we need to clean it up." Lena's stomach turned. She looked at Thomas, but he didn't react, didn't seem to care anymore. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The man turned his head slowly, his eyes narrowing as if he'd forgotten she was there. "You really don't know, do you?" he said, almost amused. Lena's mind spun. She felt the weight of his words pressing down on her, suffocating her thoughts. Her gaze flickered to Thomas, still sitting at the table like a ghost, as if the whole world had passed him by. She couldn't understand it, couldn't grasp the reality of what she was seeing. The man smirked, sensing her confusion. "Thomas was never just a man you married, Lena," he said slowly. "He was always something more." Lena's heart stopped. "What do you mean?" she whispered, fear creeping into her voice. The man's eyes glittered. "He wasn't just hiding from you. He was hiding from everyone, hiding from us, his own people." Lena's body went numb. His own people? The words felt like a punch to the chest. "You're not hearing me, are you?" the man continued. Thomas didn't retire. He ran. He ran from the life he built, this world. A world of power, control, and, well, let's just say unpleasant work. Lena's mind was racing, trying to catch up with the nightmare unfolding before her. But the pieces weren't fitting. Thomas was always so normal, so ordinary. How could this be true? The man noticed her disbelief, and his smile grew. "You thought you knew him, Lena, but he's been lying to you for years. A man like him doesn't just walk away from what he's built." Lena's throat tightened. "No, this couldn't be happening." Why did you bring me here?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The man took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. "Because you're part of this now, whether you like it or not." Lena's world seemed to spin, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "No." The word left her mouth before she could stop it. She couldn't be part of this. She didn't belong here. The man leaned in closer, his voice lowering to a dangerous whisper. "You already are. You just don't know it yet." He turned away from her, walking toward the door. "Make sure she understands, Thomas," he said without looking back. The door creaked open, and the man disappeared into the shadows. The room fell silent again, but the weight of his words hung in the air, suffocating Lena. She turned to Thomas, her heart breaking all over again. His eyes were vacant. He didn't even look at her. The man was right. Lena was trapped. And Thomas. He was a part of it. Lena stood there, frozen, the world crashing down around her. The words the man had said echoed in her mind. "You're a part of this now." Her heart was pounding in her chest, but it felt like she was moving underwater, slow, heavy, unsure. She looked at Thomas, desperate for him to see her, to wake up and explain everything, but he remained unmoving, distant. His eyes were empty, like the light had gone out of him. It was like he was already gone, and she was just standing beside a shell of the man she had once loved. Lena's breath caught in her throat. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice breaking. But he didn't respond. Her gaze flickered back to the door, where the man had just disappeared into the shadows. What had he meant? What did he want her to understand? Every instinct in her screamed to leave, to run, to escape. But she couldn't. She was trapped. "Thomas, please." Her voice cracked, desperation clawing at her throat. Still nothing. Lena reached for him, her hand trembling as it hovered just above his. "Talk to me. Please." She couldn't take it anymore. Her breath came in short gasps, her mind reeling. She needed him. She needed answers. But the man's words haunted her. "You're part of this now." And then, as if on cue, she heard the creak of the door opening again. Lena spun around, her pulse spiking. But this time, it wasn't the man who entered the room. It was Maya. Her face was cold, expression unreadable. But her eyes, those eyes, were filled with something darker. Lena felt her stomach drop. Maya was the last person she wanted to see. "You're still here?" Maya asked, her tone flat. Lena didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. Maya stepped into the room with ease, like she owned it, like she owned everything in it. Lena's eyes flicked back to Thomas. He hadn't moved, but Maya's gaze didn't leave Lena's face. "Do you understand now?" Maya asked, her voice low, almost a taunt. Lena shook her head slowly, the words getting caught in her throat. Maya's lips twisted into a small, cruel smile. "You'll get it. In time. Everyone does." Lena felt the chill of her words sink into her skin, making every part of her shiver. The silence stretched, suffocating, and Lena wanted to scream, to run. But she was powerless. "I didn't ask for this," she said quietly, her voice trembling. Maya's eyes glinted with something like amusement, but there was no warmth there. "No one does, Lena, but you're already in too deep." The words felt like a weight on her chest, too much to bear. Her thoughts scattered, desperate for something, anything, to make sense of this nightmare. "Why? Why me?" Lena's voice cracked, barely a whisper. Maya stepped closer, her heels clicking sharply on the floor. "It's not about you," she said, her tone almost pitying. "You're just caught in the middle. But you're here now, whether you like it or not." Lena's body shook as her knees buckled beneath her. She sank to the floor, her hands gripping her head, trying to hold herself together. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. But it was. She had no choice but to face the cold truth. She was trapped. And so was Thomas. And whatever had been set in motion, it was too late to stop. That Lena's mind was a blur, her thoughts crashing into each other like waves. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The room around her felt like it was closing in, the walls pressing tighter and tighter. Thomas was still there, like a ghost in front of her, silent and distant. Maya's footsteps echoed in her ears as she moved closer, her presence suffocating. "You're not the first person to be caught in this mess," Maya said, almost bored. Lena's chest tightened, her body numb. "Then what am I supposed to do?" she snapped, desperation and anger rising in her voice. Maya stopped just in front of her, eyes narrowing with cold amusement. "Nothing. There's nothing you can do." Lena wanted to scream, to fight, to run out of this place and never look back. But her legs felt like they had turned to stone, her body unwilling to obey. She was trapped in this nightmare, unable to escape, unable to change anything. Her voice was barely a whisper, but she forced the words out. "You're lying. There has to be something I can do." Maya's lips curled into a small, wicked smile. "You think you can fix this? You think you can save him?" Lena's heart skipped a beat. "Save him?" She looked at Thomas, his face still blank and empty. Could she save him? Could she even save herself? Maya laughed softly, the sound like ice scraping across glass. "You're a little late for that, don't you think?" Lena's mind raced. She thought back to everything, every quiet moment with Thomas, every secret he had kept from her. Had she been blind all this time? Had she seen only what she wanted to see? Thomas was no longer the man she had married. He was someone else entirely. Her heart shattered as she realized the depth of the lie he had lived. He hadn't just kept secrets. He had lived in a different world, a dark, dangerous world. Maya moved even closer, crouching down in front of Lena, her face inches from hers. "You're here now, Lena. You've crossed the line." Lena flinched, her breath hitching. "I didn't choose this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Maya's eyes flashed with something cold, something that made Lena shiver. "Doesn't matter. You've already made your choice. You just don't know it yet." Lena's pulse quickened as the reality of her situation set in. She was stuck in a world she never asked for, with people who weren't what they seemed. She tried to stand, her legs shaking as she pushed herself to her feet. "I'll find a way out. I'll figure this out," she said, though her voice trembled with uncertainty. Maya didn't move, didn't blink. "You won't. You can't. This isn't something you can run from." Lena's eyes filled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't break, not here, not now. Her hand reached for Thomas again, desperate to pull him back from whatever dark place he had gone. But he didn't respond. Maya's voice sliced through the silence, sharp and final. "You can't save him. He's already too far gone." Lena's hand shook as she let it fall back to her side. For the first time, a deep, crushing sense of hopelessness settled over her. Thomas had already made his choices, and now there was no way back. Lena's heart twisted as she realized the bitter truth. She wasn't just caught in the middle. She was now a part of this world, whether she wanted to be or not. And there was no escaping it. The silence in the room was deafening now, every breath feeling like a burden. Lena stood there, her chest tight, her mind swirling with questions that had no answers. She looked at Thomas, but it was as if he wasn't there. He was gone, somewhere deep inside himself, lost to the shadows of a life she couldn't understand. Her hand still trembled at her side, but she couldn't bring herself to touch him again. Maya watched her closely, her gaze unblinking, unreadable. "You still don't get it, do you?" Maya's voice was low, like a warning. Lena shook her head, unable to speak. How could she understand anything now? The whole world had turned upside down, and she was still trying to find her footing. "I'm done trying to explain," Maya continued, stepping back with a sharp turn of her heel. "Thomas had his chances. He made his choices." Lena's heart dropped into her stomach, the finality in Maya's tone sinking deep into her bones. Her legs wobbled, and she sank back down to the floor, her hands pressed to her face. Her mind screamed for answers, for some way to fix this, but she had no power here. None at all. Maya moved towards the door again, her footsteps echoing in the silence, like the ticking of a clock counting down the time left for Lena. Lena barely noticed when she stopped in the doorway, her back turned, her voice cutting through the stillness one last time. "There's only one way out, Lena, and you'll find it. One way or another." Lena looked up sharply, her chest tightening with fear. She had no idea what Maya meant, but the coldness in her voice said everything she needed to know. Before Lena could ask, Maya was gone. The door creaked shut, leaving Lena alone in the dim light, the weight of her helplessness pressing down on her. Her eyes slowly moved back to Thomas. He still hadn't moved. His face was a mask, blank and emotionless. She wanted to reach him. She wanted to break through whatever wall had been built between them, but it was impossible. She was running out of time. Lena's eyes shifted to the door, to the cold, empty hallway beyond. Could she escape? Could she find a way out of this nightmare? Her pulse quickened at the thought of leaving, of running away from this place, this life that had consumed her. But she didn't know where to go. She didn't even know who she could trust anymore. Thomas had built this life, and now it was too late for him to walk away. It was too late for both of them. Lena stood there, her heart heavy in her chest, unsure of what to do next. Every direction seemed like a dead end, and the fear that had been building in her chest had settled into something deeper, something darker. She was trapped. She was part of this world now, and there was no going back. Lena stood motionless, her mind racing, her body unwilling to move. She could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on her like a suffocating blanket. Thomas was still there, his eyes hollow, lost. Maya's words echoed in her ears, chilling her to the bone. "You're part of this world now." Lena couldn't escape the feeling that everything, every choice she'd made, every second she'd spent trusting Thomas, had led her to this dark, impossible place. She was no longer a stranger to the danger that surrounded her, no longer an outsider. The thought was unbearable, but she couldn't deny the truth. She had been pulled into this life, and now she didn't know how to get out. She glanced once more at Thomas, her heart aching with the weight of everything that had been lost between them. Was he even the same man she had married? Was he ever really the man she had thought he was? Tears welled up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not now. Not when everything depended on her making a choice. Lena took a shaky step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to make a decision. A way out had to exist. But how? Her eyes flickered toward the door, toward freedom, a way out of this nightmare, a way to escape the trap that had been set. But it was never that simple. Maya's words lingered in her mind. There's only one way out. What did she mean by that? Lena's chest tightened as the answer hit her, cold and sharp. The only way out was to become part of it, to join them, to cross that final line. And once she crossed, there would be no going back. She felt a surge of panic, but deep down, she knew it was the truth. The only way out was to become one of them, to do what Thomas had done, what Maya had done. She had no choice. But could she really take that step? Her hands trembled as she looked around the room, at the life she had known, the life she had lost. She wanted to scream, to break free, but the reality was undeniable. She was already too deep. The door was still there, but it wasn't an escape anymore. It was a decision, and with that decision, everything would change. Her life, her future, would never be the same. She turned back to Thomas one last time. His face remained unchanged. It was like he didn't even know she was there anymore. Lena knew then that she had to make her move. The time for running was over. The time for doing had arrived. She moved toward the door, her body steady, her mind set on the path she was about to take. There was no going back. But for the first time since she had stepped into this world, she felt something flicker inside her, a spark of resolve. Whatever was coming, whatever price she had to pay, she would face it. Lena's hand hovered over the door, her pulse thundering in her ears. She could feel the weight of the decision hanging over her like a guillotine. There was no escaping it now. She had seen enough, known enough, to understand what the world she was in demanded. Thomas was gone. Maya's words echoed in her mind like a mantra. There's only one way out. What had she meant by that? Lena could feel the cold metal of the door handle beneath her fingers, her body trembling as she took a slow, deliberate breath. The room felt too small, too suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. She had been living in a lie, a world of half-truths and hidden darkness. Now, there was no pretending. She was part of it. Lena's mind flickered back to her earlier moments in the room. The sound of Maya's voice, sharp and unyielding. The coldness in Thomas's eyes, like he had already said goodbye to the world she knew. Her heart ached as she thought of everything they'd lost, but she knew, deep down, that there was no turning back. She had been dragged into this nightmare, and now it was up to her to decide how to survive. The door in front of her wasn't just an exit. It was a choice she had to make. Lena's hand tightened around the doorknob, her fingers cold with resolve. She took one last glance at Thomas, his figure still motionless in the corner of the room. And then, with a final breath, she stepped into the unknown. The door clicked shut, behind her with a hollow finality. The dim hallway stretched out before her, a long corridor lined with shadows. Every step she took felt like it echoed through the dark spaces, like the world was watching, waiting for her next move. There was no going back. She was part of this world now, and whatever came next, she would face it, no matter the cost. Lena squared her shoulders, her eyes narrowing with determination. She was no longer a victim. She was a player, and she would play this game to the end. Lena walked down the hallway, her footsteps steady but heavy. The air was thick with tension, thick enough to almost taste it. Every shadow seemed to whisper, every flicker of light felt like it was watching her. But Lena didn't look back. She couldn't. The choice had been made. She could feel the weight of it on her shoulders, the weight of everything she'd left behind. Her life, the life she knew, was now a distant memory, fading with each step she took. And there was no going back. The sounds of the building creaked around her, but she didn't flinch. She couldn't afford to. The door behind her had closed with the finality of a tomb, but she knew the real weight was ahead of her. Whatever happened next, there was no more pretending, no more running from the truth. Lena's chest tightened, but she pushed forward. The shadows of the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before her, but she knew she had to keep moving. There was no room for fear anymore, not if she was going to survive this world that had claimed her. Her thoughts flickered back to Thomas one last time, to the man she had loved, the man who had turned into something unrecognizable. She had tried to save him, but he was lost, buried beneath the layers of lies and shadows he'd woven. And now, it was her turn to find her way through the dark. No more questions, no more hesitations. She would carve her own path, even if it meant walking through the darkest of nights. Lena took a deep breath, feeling the cold air fill her lungs. The door behind her felt like it belonged to someone else now, someone who hadn't known the truth. She was someone new, and this world, it was hers now. She was no longer a bystander, no longer a victim. She was in it, deep within its pulse. And when it came time to decide who would survive, Lena knew one thing. She would be the one standing in the end,